or moisture from the west coast that also makes its way out here, and it can result in pretty substantial storms, pretty substantial flash flooding events. Anybody who's lived in Tucson long enough has had the pleasure of experiencing a monsoon storm. It can be really incredible to watch and see how they develop. And it also, when we're here at work, we're very keen on watching the radar throughout the day when we're in monsoon to make sure that we're on top of all of our maintenance activities. So what is flooding? And this is a very general definition of flooding, but it's essentially an excessive amount of water that is affecting 2 or more acres of land. So that's a very general definition. We all kind of have ideas or concepts of what flooding is. We'll describe how we map it and how we identify flood hazard zones. So some of the presenters today represent more rural or suburban areas of the Tucson and surrounding area in Pima County. Specifically in Tucson, with our urban environment, we can experience flooding in a few different ways, in more developed portions of the town or in less developed areas of the town. And so we have a whole host of issues that could be related to a storm, and they're listed out here below. I won't go through every single one of them, but generally speaking, with highly urbanized development, we see a lot faster development of flows through the town. We see a lot more needs for maintenance activities to clean out storm drain infrastructure, to maintain drainage systems that are man-made or constructed. So a good portion of our efforts are to make sure that those constructed systems are functioning properly and are able to handle the flows that they're presented with. City of Tucson has a pretty robust floodplain management plan. The link to it is below. We can share it with everybody to make sure that they have it in case that link doesn't work or you can't write it down quick enough. But floodplain management plan identifies all the activities that the City of Tucson does to mitigate, to reduce, and to inform the community about flood hazards and what can be done. It covers all of the City of Tucson. It provides a lot of really good information, and I'd suggest everybody take some time to go through and read it. We just recently completed a revision to this, so it's up to date and has a lot of good information. The City of Tucson, as with the surrounding communities, participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, which uses a community rating system, which is essentially a scorecard on how each community performs or how each community enacts floodplain regulations. And the benefit of that in participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, first is we get a lot of valuable information from our partners in FEMA and other state and local agencies to make our community more resilient, but also we are able to obtain reductions in flood insurance through CRS activities, through CRS points. And so we maintain that program for the City of Tucson, and we get credit for the work that we do. And part of that includes presentations like this, community outreach, making people aware of what the hazards are, how they can approach them and deal with them, how they can obtain flood insurance. This is a good picture of the retail. It's a little old, and I believe that this is at Campbell Avenue. Actually, it might be one bridge off, but anyway, it's a good example of the Rito River at flood stage. So even if you don't live within a flood zone, you can obtain flood insurance. We'll discuss floodplain mapping and how you can inquire about your property. And we have lots of good staff and resources to provide that information to make sure that you're making the best decision for yourself and for your property. You can obtain flood insurance even if it's not required through your mortgage. You can see that the city here, we do occasionally get tropical storms coming through. This is one from 2016, kind of showing how we can be impacted by greater storm events. So within the city, we generally speaking have two types of floodplains. We have FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, special flood hazard areas. Those are floodplain maps that are developed and maintained by FEMA themselves. And then we also have City of Tucson regulatory flood hazard areas. And this image here can show you the distinction between the both, where we have City of Tucson flood hazard areas immediately adjacent to a FEMA flood hazard area. This can often be confusing in how the information is presented. There's lots of layers. We have a really good GIS system called Map Tucson, where all this information is presented. City staff is available to look at individual properties, look at structures, and help individuals determine if their property is impacted by one of these two types of regulatory flood hazard areas. We like to remind everybody that a permit is needed for a new wall or a fence. So we throw these in the slides just to make sure everybody's aware of it. We can identify obstructions or clearance issues, drainage problems associated with improper review or improper construction of walls, fences, permits, or buildings. So there are, within those regulatory flood hazard areas, there are different types. We have low, medium, and risk areas. Lower risk areas are generally what we would consider sheet flow or overbank, where essentially a wash exceeds its capacity and water spills out on either side, or we have a very light sheet flow over a large surface area. High risk areas are generally considered to be washes themselves, main drainage patterns where we have significant volumes of water moving downstream. There's multiple definitions, and I'll go back to just reiterating that the purpose of this presentation is to make people aware that they have the resources and the contacts available to them, no matter where they live, to understand what these definitions mean and how they're presented. So if you go and you look up a flood zone map, you'll see lots of information. You'll see the boundaries of the flood zone. You'll see information about how deep it is, how much water there is. There's a whole slate of different definitions. FEMA has a whole category, AE, AAO, etc. And they all mean different things. And that's what we're here to do, is to clear those issues up, identify exactly what the hazard is to a property, and then determine what the best course of action is for that owner. To reiterate, it's important to know that city staff is here, and the other individuals that will be presenting today are available to discuss the higher risk, low risk flood hazard areas, any questions related to flooding and development. Just locating yourself in some of these mapping systems can be difficult, but we do it all day long, and so we're intimately familiar with how the information is presented and what it means. There's another good example in town here in Tucson. If the viewers here today live in Tucson, very familiar with Speedway Boulevard in the university area. And so here is an example of a flood zone on the north and south side of Speedway. And these zones are established through engineering study in conjunction with our partners at Pima County. We will do basin-wide, watershed-wide studies to establish what these boundaries are. The studies give us depth, flow, and then also the overall perimeter of the flood zone. And why these studies are important is to make sure that we're making the best decisions possible about new development, that homeowners are informed about these flood hazards. We use it for emergency management. We have notification programs that go out when monsoons come in or when we're expecting inclement weather, to make sure that any road crossings are properly identified and marked, to make sure it's easy for people to get around town when these events come through. Anybody who's experienced it knows that they develop very quick. A storm in Tucson will often just kind of move through. You'll see it develop no matter what direction it's moving in. You know, most of the time we're talking an hour or less from when it impacts one side of Tucson and moves its way through. But those volumes of water can accumulate rather significantly. And so what you're seeing here is basically the development of a flood zone as the result of one of those types of events moving through the city. So we also regulate new construction and buildings to make sure that structures and people are protected from these floodwaters when they develop. And so the Stone Avenue crossing is rather famous north of Speedway. So this is a good example. So here's an example, kind of one of those fast moving storms that comes through. The Tucson area generally drains to the north. The water ultimately discharges into the Santa Cruz River. And so those flood zone maps show how these volumes of water can develop after rain events. So again, they're very quick, right? Anybody who's experienced it know that all of a sudden it can be sunny, and then there's a huge deluge, and they move through the system, and that's why proper maintenance and upkeep are very important. Keeping people informed about the impacts to their property, impacts to their structure, is also very important. So this is a very informative slide here. Generally speaking, what does the city of Tucson do to manage these risks? So as I mentioned before, we have a floodplain management program as part of the National Flood Insurance Program. The efforts there allow us to accrue points that help reduce the costs associated with flooding, either through insurance or by making sure that new construction is more resilient and safer. We have a pretty robust floodplain ordinance that we enforce, and those paired with other development codes and other development standards and partnering with surrounding communities really helps people understand the impacts that they may experience, but also we want to make sure that new construction and new systems that go into place are able to address future and existing conditions. So what property can be insurable? Well, a building can be, right? So we want to explain to people, and the state will speak later on this, what type of insurance is available and ways people can manage and mitigate risk. What can you do as a homeowner? In general, we have some guidance. So the first thing I would suggest is that if you have questions, whether or not your property is in a flood zone or in a hazard area, contact the jurisdiction that you're in, City of Tucson, Pima County, Marana, Oro Valley, et cetera, and have a conversation with engineering staff about your property and the surrounding areas, so you get an understanding of where you are. These are general tips that are good for anybody to follow, regardless of whether or not you're in a flood hazard area. I know I'm constantly going out and checking my house and making sure everything's clean and clear. And if you can imagine the difficulty of cleaning out a gutter on an individual house, the city, along with the other jurisdictions, have the task of maintaining the entire storm drain network, all the washes, all the systems. And so it can be quite a heavy lift for everybody to make sure that the way things are built are maintained, so that we have good performance when those really quick systems move through. So moving away a little bit from flood zones, the city of Tucson has a few mapped levee areas, and this is a little bit of a transition here. But those areas are fairly unique. Most people are not aware that there's a couple levee systems in Tucson. One of them is just south of Grant Road along the I-10. And in keeping with the previous slides about these systems that are constructed to manage and mitigate flood risk, as part of the National Flood Insurance Program, the city of Tucson is responsible for maintaining these pieces of infrastructure. And so it's an example of activities that the city, county, et cetera, will undertake to manage and to mitigate flood risk. So here's another good example of that area down there. You can see the storm drain network that goes through. You can see different levels of inundation and how those flood zones impact that developed area. Lots of definitions there. So we have 100-year floodplains, we've got 500-year floodplains. And structures need to be protected against a certain type of risk. And in this case, the risk that the structures are protected against is a 100-year storm risk. So the slide reiterates again what is the city doing, what are other jurisdictions doing to lower that risk. And advances in modeling, right? Advances in design, routine maintenance activities, presentations such as this, coordination with federal and state agencies for maintenance of existing drainage infrastructure, for construction of new systems. The city's recently actually is near completion of a downtown links drainage infrastructure project, which will greatly mitigate flooding in the downtown area. The Broadway widening project was an example of a project recently completed that is an example of large infrastructure projects that the city undertakes to mitigate these risks. So in the introduction slides, we were going to discuss wildfire risks. That's been a topic as of late. If everybody recalls, there was I believe the Bighorn fire went through the Catalina Mountains a few years back. And there was concern not only from, the fire itself, obviously, but the after effects associated with that. And from a flooding standpoint, a fire can greatly increase the potential for flooding. So in general, for wildfire risk, we know there's best practices, just like the slide before, best practices to protect a property from flooding. There are good practices to protect a property from fire damage, removing vegetation, keeping things clear, cleaning out debris, etc. Another example of the 2006, I'm trying to picture. This is looking west near the racetrack, I think. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong later, but when was the National Flood Insurance Program established? There's Flood Insurance Act in 1968, which established the National Flood Insurance Program. And that outlined what the requirements are for municipalities to perform regulatory activities to enforce floodplain ordinances and codes, and also to discuss how flood insurance premiums are determined and how risk is associated to structures. Most of the regional water courses in Tucson, if you're a resident of Tucson, the two real big ones are the Santa Cruz River and the Rito River, but we also have the Tanque Verde, we have the Pantano, and most of the regional water courses are protected against a 100-year flood event, against erosion and also against flooding risk. And so this is an example of why it's important to check to see, particularly if you're considering purchasing property or if you're unfamiliar with where you live, what protections are afforded by the community and by other jurisdictions to mitigate flood hazard risks. So again, the city is here to verify, check parcels, check listing statuses, check flood zone information. We actually have a formal process that we can go through called a flood zone status process that a resident or a potential buyer can present to their insurer. It's a community signed document that provides insurance agencies information about how the property is impacted. These are available through the city. This slide's just a tad bit out of order. So we have a flood zone status information request form. So oftentimes insurance companies will ask, is this property in or out of a floodplain? If you were looking at the previous slides, you can tell that there's a lot of information out there. There's lots of different types of flood zones. There's 100-year, 500-year, there's federal, there's local, there's unmapped floodplains. There's just a lot of information, and it can be hard to process. So that's why the city is here. We can actually supply an official document to a resident, to a potential property owner, that they can use to with their insurance company to determine what type of insurance is best for them and for their property. These are available through the city. One way to mitigate flood risk and to address flood insurance questions is to have an elevation certificate performed on an individual property. The purpose of that document for an existing building is to determine how the structure is elevated compared to the flood zone that it is in. And there are differing effects that can have. It can show that the structure is substantially elevated above the flood zone, which will help from a flood insurance and from a risk perspective. It can also show that a structure is below the flood elevation, which can also have a detrimental impact. And that's why it's important to discuss how these documents are used, and that's what city staff is here for. An example of construction certificates showing how structures are documented to be built above or outside of the floodplain. So we discussed a while back kind of best practices to mitigate wildfires on property. This is an example of how a wildfire can impact flooding. And so essentially what happens is the ground is compacted and made smoother. and the burning of vegetation creates essentially a somewhat impenetrable layer on the soil. So when we talk about urban areas in Tucson where there's a lot of pavement, a lot of concrete, and how quickly those floods can develop, essentially it's the same thing. Those natural areas that were at one point in time more capable of absorbing water and slowing water down, which is what we want, are now essentially hardened surfaces that create more substantial flows when they receive rain. So we're able to identify these flow areas and discuss with property owners the potential risk. There's debris flows associated with wildfires, and there are other things that can increase the risk associated with living adjacent to a flood zone or in a flood zone in a natural area that's prone to wildfire. Here's some good contact information. So there's 2 departments at the city of Tucson that somebody might encounter if they're interested in floodplain and erosion. Floodplain administration occurs through the city of Tucson Department of Transportation and Mobility, the department that I work in. New construction on private property is managed by the city of Tucson Development Planning and Development Services Department. Either one of those departments has qualified staff on hand to discuss and answer any questions that people might have about flood and erosion, flood zone statuses, elevation certificates, and so forth. And so here's good contact information for either one of those departments. So the presenter today was intended to be Elizabeth Leibold. Her information is presented here. My information was presented in the slide above. This is what we do all day long. And so we are here, and there's other information available. We discussed Map Tucson, where all of our information about flood zones are housed. It's a GIS mapping software. You can obtain FEMA maps through FEMA Map Service Center. Lots of good information here. So I'd suggest taking a snapshot of this if you're interested in learning more about flood hazards and reading up on the topic. This slide makes it into every presentation. For some reason, we enjoy showing a stuck TPD car in a wash. It's just an example of if you have any concerns about a flooded road or inclement weather or a hazard, just turn around and go back, and the road will be cleared at a later point. So this is near the end of the presentation, just some good pictures showing how an otherwise calm day can turn into a pretty quick rain event. And so it's important to know what these risks are, how they can impact the property, and anybody who's been through a monsoon storm can appreciate this picture or these pictures. So I don't think that Sarita's here. Did Sarita join? Sarita did not join. So I believe the next speaker is going to be, I want to say John Spiker at Oro Valley, if I'm correct, and we'll transfer it over there. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations.
All right, can everybody hear me?
Sounds good, Spiker.
Great. Well, good morning, everybody. And John, thank you so much for your presentation. I want to let everybody know most of the agencies are doing similar things, so you might see repetitive discussions on things, but we all act independently pertaining to our borders and boundaries. So my name is John Spiker. I am the Stormwater Utility Manager for the town of Oro Valley. And we're going to present a little bit of information on how you can help protect yourself and understand how the town of Oro Valley operates from a floodplain perspective and what information we're serving up. So let's get to that. 3 things I want to cover here. The town ordinance that governs our floodplain and erosion hazard management. Then we'll talk a little bit about floodplain mapping, kind of tagging onto what John Van Winkle mentioned at the City of Tucson. And then equally, we'll be presenting some contacts should anybody have any questions or want more information. So let's start with the town ordinance here. Chapter 17 is our floodplain and erosion hazard management ordinance here that governs flooding and design for stormwater and flood control elements. So that is regulated by the Arizona Department of Water Resources. They come around regularly with a community assistance visit. So they'll come out, they'll take a look at your processes, your procedures, some of the projects that are ongoing, and just make sure that our floodplain management ordinances are up to date. Any changes happening at the federal level with FEMA or at the state level with ADWR, that the local jurisdictions are keeping up with that. Our most recent CAV, Community Assistance Visit, was in January of this year. So again, the folks came down from the state, walked around the field, took a look at our projects, understood our permitting processes, and took a look at our ordinance. So those are regularly being looked at by others, which is a good thing. We want to make sure we're staying or keeping pace at the federal and state level. So next up, we've got our floodplain mapping. We've got a couple of different things similar to what John at the city was mentioning here. I want to tout our interactive floodplain inquiry map, and we'll kind of walk through some of that here. So first things first, you want to go to our homepage here at Oro Valley. That's orovalleyaz.gov. And you'll see up in the corner, there's a little search bar. Just type in floodplain, and that will bring you to our floodplain information page. Pretty easy. I just checked it this morning. It all works fine. But again, I want to mention we've got 2 different ways that the public can kind of gain information from a floodplain perspective on their parcel or prospective parcel. So first up is our interactive map. There's a little link on this page. It says floodplain inquiry map. You click that and it brings you into our GIS mapping page. That is just a generic snapshot, if you will, of any given property in town here. As John mentioned, we do have several categories within those floodplains. We do offer up the FEMA floodplains. We offer up local floodplains that are usually derived from development projects. So a subdivision comes online. They are requested to abide by our Chapter 17 ordinance and develop the project appropriately. We will then obtain that floodplain and put it into our GIS category so that it is available for public consumption. And thirdly, we have a special projects or special studies. Those are internal floodplain or watershed studies, or partnering with folks like at Pima County Regional Flood Control District. So those are also offered up as tidbits of information. We also, similar to the City of Tucson, we do have an official floodplain determination for folks, mortgage companies, insurance companies. That is a $15 fee. The nice thing up here in Oro Valley, it is all online. You don't have to mail anything in. You can sign up online through our customer portal and obtain an official letter via email. So that's a nice convenience. So let's walk through the flood inquiry map just so you can see what the town is offering up. So as you make your way in, you're going to see a splash screen. You get through that. This is what will pop up. All the floodplains, the known floodplains. I want to correct myself. We don't know everything, but what we do know is presented here on our floodplain inquiry map. And it is interactive. You can zoom in. You can type in your address up in the upper left there, and that will zoom right into your parcel that you're looking at. So for prospective buyers in the town of Oro Valley, you can look at various properties and see what the floodplain status is. If you have more questions, you can always call us up. We can walk you through what you're seeing or any issues you may have. So this is kind of the generic floodplain for the entire town. We do receive waters from outside of the town boundaries, from Pima County, from Pinal County, from Mount Lemon. The biggest water course here is the Cañada del Oro, or the CDO wash. The nice benefit for the town is Pima County owns and manages that particular wash. So we're in constant communication with our partners over at Pima County. And then the water's leaving the town. They're more often going right back into Pima County. We do partner up with Marana from time to time. We've got some watersheds on the west side of town that are going into Marana. So we've extended our floodplain boundaries a bit outside of the town just to provide some consistency for those looking. So we're going to drill in a little bit deeper here. As you zoom into any parcel, we are now looking at CDO High School here at Calle Concordia and Oracle Road. So you would click on any given parcel and you can see a little pop-up box would show up. Gives you a bit of information. You see some arrows up at the top of that blue banner. You would scroll through those and it would highlight the floodplain. And we tell you what type of floodplain it is, what watershed it's coming out of, the year that floodplain was created, and any other pertinent information that we thought the public might want to know. So this again is all available to the public through our flood inquiry map. It's self-serving, which is great. It gives people a really rough idea of what they could expect for any given parcel. And again, any more questions, they're more than welcome to call us up. But we're constantly updating this thing as new developments come online or new floodplain studies are being completed. We're offering those up for public consumption. So lastly, here's some contact information. Paul Kiesler is the town engineer, happens to also be the public works director and the floodplain administrator. He wears a ton of hats. Again, I'm the stormwater division manager, and we've got some phone number and email contacts here. So I encourage everybody, please take a peek at your parcel, see what kind of impacts might be coming your way. Monsoons are right around the corner here. So John Van Winkle had a great slide on what you can do on your property to mitigate the flood risks. I encourage you to look through that and take a walk around your property. If you've got drainage channels, make sure those are unblocked and maintained. If you have flood vents in your back walls or your side yards, make sure those are unblocked so that water can freely flow from the backyard to where it's supposed to go. Those are little things that really do make a big difference. Clean out your rain gutters. Those are all extremely helpful in making sure the water gets to where it needs to go. Thank you so much for allowing me to present this morning, and I believe the state is up next.
I believe it's Pima County.
Okay, Joe, you're up.
All right. All right, guys, I want to thank you all for attending today's presentation. I just realized that it was John Van Winkle, then John Spiker. Now it's Joe Kafari, and I believe the next one will be a James. So we're hitting you with all the J's today. But I am going to focus mostly on flood insurance itself. So I just want to verify, can you guys see that screen all right? All right, getting a thumbs up. So Pima County does similar floodplain management practices, as you heard from the city of Tucson, town of Oro Valley. Water doesn't stop at jurisdictional lines, so having that community buy-in, that regional, floodplain management practice is essential. So thank you guys again for presenting. But to get into flood insurance, we're going to talk about what's called Risk Rating 2.0. It's a new national flood insurance pricing methodology that went into effect April 1st. So if anyone's familiar with flood insurance or has looked at it or has flood insurance, you may have seen some changes over the past year. And I want to kind of explain those changes to you guys. Risk Ratings tagline is equity in action. And that means that property owners will no longer pay more than their share in premiums based on the value of their home. So what FEMA is trying to do when doing these pricing methodologies is to look at the individual characteristics of that structure. How far are you away from a water source? What's your unique characteristics? How much does the home cost? The whole idea around this is that a mansion in the foothills should be priced differently than a mobile home in a valley, in a wash. And so making it more individual to that property instead of doing a broad swath across the nation. This is a major overhaul of flood insurance. We started seeing these changes back in October 2021, where the new policyholders were subject to the rating system. And then it completely went into effect April 1st, 2022, and it was not an April Fool's joke. There we go. So what's the deal with risk rating 2.0? So like we talked about, it's looking more at that individual structure instead of making these broad swath assumptions for the pricing of flood insurance. FEMA wants to communicate what is that individual risk for that property, and then translate that to the communities. So they want to set those premiums strongly to signal those risks and then promote the mitigation aspects of how to protect yourself. How can you protect your structure and lower that flood insurance premium? So some pre-risk rating 2.0 statistics. So we're looking at what's called the legacy model, the original flood insurance. There was about 5 million policies in force, accounting for $1.3 trillion in coverage. We talked a little bit here about the community rating system. John Van Winkle was talking about that. 75% of the communities across the nation, so city of Tucson, Sahuarita, Marana, Pima County, there's over 22,000 of them across the nation. And a majority of those flood insurance policies come from those communities. And then you factor in those discounted rates. So it really pays to be a member of the CRS. So what's changed from that legacy model into the risk rating 2.0? Risk rating was essentially designed to make the quote process easier for flood insurance agents. That was the whole goal of the project. So it simplified that quote process for an agent. It used to take roughly 20 to 30 minutes to price flood insurance. It now takes about 3 minutes. So you can do a variety of quotes. You can generate quotes faster. So it looks really good on the insurance agent side. A huge change is the elimination of the mandatory elevation certificate requirement. So previously, a property owner had to submit what's called an elevation certificate, which relates the finished floor of the building to the highest adjacent natural grade. The higher or the more of a difference, so the higher that finished floor is from the ground level, the better your pricing would be. That mandatory certificate is now gone for flood insurance purposes. They use a system called CoreLogic to determine that, and we'll get into that in a little bit later. Another major change was expanding that CRS discounts to all the floodplains and uniformly applying them across the community. So it previously only applied to those FEMA special flood hazard areas. And then those outside areas would get a 10% discount flat. Now, if you're in Pima County, you get a 35% discount, no matter if you're in a flood zone or out of a flood zone. 20% discount for the city of Tucson, 15% for Marana. So that's a great aspect. It really opened up that discount to literally everybody within that community. Another major change is what's called the replacement cost value of a structure. So rather than looking at what does the house actually cost, what's the full cash value as termed by the assessors, let's look at what the replacement of the damage would be. So it's considering that loss difference between the higher valued and lower valued homes. It's going to cost a lot more to replace that mansion rather than, that manufactured home. You know, the mansion's going to have to new granite, new tile, new drywall, new everything, new appliances, rather than the manufactured home where you may only be replacing an I-beam or one CMU column underneath. So why should the manufactured home have to be paying the same rates to do that? So again, looking at it individualistically. What didn't change or what's not changing? The surcharges, of course. Congress and FEMA are always going to get you coming and going on all of those surcharges. But those premium discounts did not change. They actually expanded. And then you can transfer some discounts to new property owners. If I want to keep this overarching and not get too into the weeds, but if a home is just renewing a policy, it's not at what's called the full risk yet. Previously, if you sold the property, that new property owner would have that full risk assumption. But now you're getting less of a, or now you're getting that discount when a property transfers. So it's a little bit in the weeds there, but they expanded on it. What's being phased out are those preferred risk policies. So those X zones, if you're not in a FEMA flood zone, and you were getting like that 10% discount, now you're getting that, now you're open up to that full discount. So you're not a preferred risk. And again, it's looking at it individually and not making broad swaths across the community. So what are some of the factors that go into pricing flood insurance? There's rating and building variables. So focusing on rating right now, what is your flood type? What does the floodplain look at that structure? Is it related to a stream, river, or ocean? You know, we don't have oceans yet in Arizona. Or is it more related to a rain source? Are you just looking at that natural drainage? So what is that floodplain hazard? What's your distance to the flooding source? Are you know, the closer you are, the more at chance you are of being flooded. How high do you sit above that ground? We talked about that a little bit. And then what's the flood frequency, which really goes back to the flood type on that property. The main building variables, we talked about replacement cost value. What's the construction type? You know, wood is going to be more inundated by water than masonry would be. So, you know, making allowances for that. What's your foundation type? Are you on a slab? Are you on a fill pad? Do you have a crawl space? There's a bunch of different building variables related to that. The number of floors, of course, you know, if you're a 2-story house and your first floor collapses, there's a pretty good chance that the second floor is going to have some issues as well. So that's now a factor. But there's also some mitigation credits associated with that. How high is your electrical equipment elevated? You know, your electrical outlets don't want to be inundated by water. So the higher they are, the better or more protected that structure is going to be. So continuing with that, it's pretty neat how FEMA prices this. There's a lot of rating engines and a lot of software out there. CoreLogic is a company that essentially contracts with FEMA to do this work, and it's using satellites, you know, to price these quotes. So what's really neat is that second bullet point, the local relative elevation. So what they do is they take the center point of your house or your structure that you're insuring, and they go out 500 meters squared, and they take an average of that land. So if your structure sits higher than that average, hey, that's great. That means that water is going to be draining away from the structure. But if you sit lower than that average, there's a pretty good chance that, you know, you're essentially in a bathtub. And so there's going to be more of a risk. So it's pretty cool how they do that. Where we see the biggest differences obviously are in the mountainous regions, right? I mean, you have terrain and contours and slopes. But if you're in a subdivision, you know, chances are that you're going to be priced pretty similar to your neighbor 500 meters away. And that's just based on that local relative elevation. That picture down below are some of the examples of elevation methods. Typically what we see in Arizona are going to be the slab on grade, or those crawl space building elevations for your first floor height. So FEMA's obviously has to regulate, some coastal areas. So that's where we see kind of that right side of the picture there, where you're elevated on post piles or piers, or you have some sort of garage enclosure underneath and you walk up to that first floor height. So really what we're looking at is that left side for Arizona. Distance to the flooding source is the key factor. It's the greatest effect on premiums. The closer you are to a flooding source, the higher you're going to be. And it's just, it's essentially common sense, right? That's where it's coming from. Elevation of your structure is next, and then your replacement cost value. So those are the three biggest factors that go into it. When this started getting rolled out, like I said, this was designed to help flood insurance agents. Floodplain managers were not involved in this process. And so we, as floodplain managers and communities throughout the nation, we really had to ask these questions to FEMA. What do you mean distance to flooding source? Where is that coming from? How do you base that off of? Where's repetitive, or where's your RCV coming from? So the flooding source is based on what's called the National Hydrography Dataset version 2+. And I'll show you what that means, but it's a GIS software that FEMA has used across the nation. It's how they run their models. And we finally have access to look at that and to look and see where that is. A lot of questions or a lot of things that floodplain managers were hearing from the community when this was being rolled out is, hey, I have what's called a letter of map revision. I had an engineer come through. They essentially determined that I'm an island in the middle of the ocean. I'm out of that floodplain. How come I'm still, subject to these high flood requirements? Good question. Previously you would get yourself out of that flood insurance. You would be an X zone. You would be a legacy policy. You would have low flood insurance rates. But the new risk rating is still seeing that the risk is there, right? You're still right next to that floodplain and that flooding source. We model to the 100-year storm, the 100-year flood. This is my favorite answer from FEMA. Well, the risk is still there at the 101-year flood event. And that's really what it is. It's the potential for the greater floods in the area. And now as floodplain managers, we have to start dealing with climate change. How do we model for that? The potential for risk is only going to increase. And so FEMA wants to model that for future years. What the LOMR and the letter of map amendment do is getting you out of that mandatory purchase requirement. So if you are in a FEMA special flood hazard area and you have a mortgage associated with that structure, it's required that you have flood insurance. That LOMR, if you can prove that you're an island in the ocean, will get you out of that mandatory purchase requirement. So you're not forced to pay for it, but the option's still there. In general, from what we're seeing, for every $1,000 of coverage, it's about $15 cost on your premium. So it's kind of scalable. The absolute maximum that FEMA will insure is $12,000. And that's if you have $250,000 of building coverage, $100,000 of content coverage, and your replacement cost value for the structure is $600,000. So that's the absolute maximum that FEMA will write or insure you for. These were just some questions originally, like we talked about, what does distance to the flooding source mean? And we were talking about that national hydrography. Another thing that we saw was a surcharge. It was called the reserve fund assessment. There was no explanation of that until we started asking some questions. And it's essentially a reserve fund So it's insurance for the insurer, and it's essentially a separate account to pay for claims after catastrophic flood events. So think the latest Hurricane Ian, down in Florida, all of New Jersey's latest storms, Louisiana's latest storms. This reserve fund is essentially a backup to pay for those claims. I'm taking kind of the pessimistic view, and I think a lot of Arizonans do, is, hey, why are we as Arizonans paying for these Florida flood insurance claims? We're paying 18% of our premium is going directly to Florida. We're not seeing that. That's something that FEMA has to address. They've been beaten around the bush on it, and that's something that as floodplain managers across the nation are actively fighting against. Let's keep that reserve fund assessment in Arizona. What if we have natural disaster? We're subject to storms and major flooding as well. So to be continued on that one. That hydrography data set, that right-hand picture, is what FEMA has determined, and they use a lot of streamlines and polygons. So you can kind of see, if you're familiar with the Tucson region, those red braids. We have the Santa Cruz, the Rito, Tanque Verde. So that kind of gives you a picture of that area. That circled area is around I-10 and Orange Grove area. And then that left-hand picture is kind of a zoomed in approach, so you can see that area as well. So looking at some case studies, these were done in 2021, literally the day after risk rating went into effect, so October 2nd, 2021. This is up in the northeast area part of town, heading up to Mount Lemon. This is a property that we knew was not built correctly. It's in violation with Pima County flood control for a variety of reasons. So we knew that this would be a high hazard home. And you can see, a bunch of stuff going in there, but their full coverage is $3,300. We said, okay, well, that looks, somewhat normal for what it is. Then we ran another case study. This was in the city of Tucson. They're right next to like Swan Road, the Rito River. This is a bank protected area. They're outside of the floodplain. They're in a subdivision, normal home. And we saw that price, that coverage amount, $4,800. That's, that's $1,500 more than this home that's in violation. So we started asking those questions. Well, why? What's the big difference? These guys aren't in a floodplain. They're in a subdivision, bank protection. And it goes back to that flooding source, your distance to the flooding source. The way risk rating looks at it, they have beachfront property. They don't know that it's bank protected. They're seeing this major river channel right next to a property, and they're rating it as such. So this is another sticking point across the nation. Hey, we've done all these capital improvements. We've done this bank protection all throughout our region. We've done drainage infrastructure. We have dams. We have levees. We have stuff to protect the community, but risk rating doesn't take that into account. That's what we as floodplain managers see as being the biggest flaw with this changeover, is that it's not taking local information and translating it up to FEMA. What is good is that this is not a mandatory purchase requirement situation. So that homeowner who happened to be the insurance agent who priced his home is not going to obtain that flood insurance. $4,800 is a steep amount. So that was talking about the national flood insurance premiums. I recently attended a conference all about flood insurance, and I was happy to see private flood insurance. So what we're seeing on the federal side is a huge reduction across the nation of those federally written policies post risk rating 2.0. And that's just the That's just the way it is. The way the rating engine, it's scaring people off from obtaining it. But we're seeing a lot of increases on the private flood insurance side. And this has historically been a black box. They don't have to be transparent, the private companies. So they're not, whereas FEMA does. So the data is not as readily available. But all that being said, the data that we were presented with is that there's now over 250 companies writing private flood insurance policies. And they're looking more at the flood zone type. Are you in a floodplain or are you not? And that's really more legacy-like, so pre-risk rating 2.0. So if you guys see that picture, I have some circled, images there. This was an example, and so you can see the premiums under the national flood insurance. Pre-risk rating, it was $650. Now with risk rating, that policy went up to $6,200. Again, distance to flooding source. That's a huge increase. That property owner's not going to get national flood insurance premiums. But if you look at that second circle, that's the private flood insurance side, $1,400. So you can see that there's still a slight increase, but not drastically up to 10x. This is only a couple $100 more. So the private flood insurance side is really starting to gain momentum, and it's again based on their rating variables that goes into generating a quote. What I found unique is that they're also looking at the occupancy type. A manufactured home is going to be priced differently than single family residence. Then you're looking at it, is it a medical facility? Is it assisted living? Is there a water treatment aspect to it? So there's a whole bunch of different building and rating variables, but still pretty similar in the thinking. What is I'm not going to say a holdup, but I think so with the federal. Let me back up. If you're in a FEMA floodplain, you have that mandatory purchase requirement to protect the mortgage company from a loss. Historically, private flood insurance was not accepted, right? FEMA wants to keep everything federal. They want to keep it amongst themselves. A lot of mortgage lenders are now opening up to accepting private flood insurance quotes. So about 90% of the major mortgage lenders now accept private flood insurance policies. That is huge. That's a drastic change in the real estate market. When risk rating came into effect, we heard from a lot of the community nationwide that people could not afford to buy homes anymore, right? They have to get that mandatory purchase. And if you're looking at something at $4,800 just for your flood insurance, that's going to price out a lot of people. So these mortgage lenders are now revising their policies and their regulations to accept that private flood insurance. And that's really just to stabilize that real estate market and make them more safe against protecting that. So it's a very interesting and unique trend. I think we're going to see a lot more private flood insurance policies coming to the forefront. The 250 companies I do expect to increase and grow. But then again, with a catastrophic event like a Hurricane Ian or, a Katrina or something, do those private flood insurance companies have enough money, to reimburse? So it's going to be an interesting trend to monitor. There's some stats there down at the bottom, about 400,000 policies in 2020, and then that's grown to 550 policies in 2021. Right when risk rating changed, 150 policies more. So again, we'll see what those trends look like. Some other updates from the conference I attended, risk rating 2.0, FEMA has heard from a lot of people, senators, Congress, constituents. They're not happy with the current system. So FEMA's answer is, hey, we do want to revise it. We do want to modify it. We want to work with floodplain managers. Their thing is it's not just an update, it's a whole new product. They're relating it to Microsoft and Apple. You know, you put it on operating system and then it has to get calibrated through different versions. That's how they're looking at risk rating. Producing the quote is easy, but communicating the change in price is very hard. An insurance agent is not a floodplain manager, and the insurance agents are having to answer these questions. What does a zone X mean? How come I'm, 20 feet away from a flooding source when it's just a drainage, it's just a wash in my backyard? Flood insurance agents can't answer that. It really needs to be the floodplain managers. So how do we work on that symbiosis between the two entities to come up, to relate that out to the constituents? Let's see. The declaration page, which shows your overall pricing, your premium price, that's lacking right now. It really gives you about 4 things of what goes into your premium price, but there's all that back end stuff. So that declaration page needs to be expanded. And that's going to help the insurance agent explain that difference. And then, someone still has questions, they can take it to their community and they can say, can you explain, what this is and what goes into it? And with that expansion of the declaration page, we should be able to do that. Another interesting factor that they're exploring right now is what's called direct to consumer. So think of it as a mobile risk rating 2.0, and it's really taking the insurance agent out of the equation. So someone can go to a property, or they can go to their own property and walk around the structure and answer their own questions. It would kind of be, is your home 2 stories? Yes. It's a mobile app. You just answer questions that go through it. What they're saying is homes don't have a VIN number, right? It's not a vehicle that you can track and see the history of. Homes change regularly, so we need to provide the customer with their own options to develop their own quote, and then maybe finalize it with a FEMA federal insurance agent after that. Another exploration FEMA's thinking, do we just make ourselves the insurance agents? We can take out the insurance agents who have to deal with homeowners and fire and other insurance aspects. Maybe we just have specific flood insurance agents at the federal level to answer those questions. I can see pros and cons to that, but it's great to hear that they're changing. When this rolled out, this was absolute no changes. We're not going to talk to anybody. This is the system, closed door. But 1 year later, after they've been hit by senators and congressmen, it's really nice to hear that they're open to changing and to receiving some feedback at least. This bullet point down here will be my last talking point here. It needs to address the affordability aspect. People in manufactured homes, low income, underserved areas are still paying a lot more than those $1 million mansions up in the foothills, right? So we're seeing a big discrepancy. FEMA's tagline is equity in action. We need to make it equitable. Our joke is equity in action. You just combine those 2 words. It's really ineffective right now. It's inactive for what it is. So we need to address those pricing, whether that's grants or giving allowances. We have the census data. We know where those less fortunate areas are. Maybe you give an extra discount to those areas to help those people and really protect them when the loss does come. So with that, if you just Google risk rating 2.0, you're going to come up with millions of articles, pros and cons with it. I tried to take the middle line here. But as floodplain managers, we're keeping tabs on this. We don't write the quotes. We just try to translate that information to the public. And that's kind of hard for us to do right now. unfortunately, but we're slowly chipping away at it, and we're excited with where it could go. And it's come a long way since inception. And as floodplain managers, we'll be monitoring this and making that transition for you as the property owner as easy as it can. So with that, I do want to thank you guys and turn it over to the State of Arizona Insurance Office for another J. Take it away.
Is that up and everybody can see it?
It is.
Okay, great. Well, good morning. My name is James McGuffin. I am the PIO with the Arizona Department of Insurance and Financial Institutions. We call it DIFI because the former does not roll off your tongue very well. And I am joined today with by Aaron Klug. Aaron has found out this morning 34 years with the former Department of Insurance and now the combined DIFI. So Aaron is here to basically correct me on anything that I misstate and to answer any questions. So thanks for being here. This is our contact information. Most of us work remotely, but we can all be contacted at this address, and our website is difi.az.gov. So I want to cover a little bit about DIFI. We do actually a variety of things within the agency. We have oversight of insurance, we have banking, and we have the Automobile Theft Authority, all combined into our agency. But today, of course, we'll be talking mostly, certainly about insurance and what we do there. So we license all types of insurance companies and agents. We monitor the financial health of insurers to make sure that they can actually pay claims when they're made, in furtherance of policies. And then we review several types of insurance contracts before the insurers can offer them for sale, and we do that to make sure they are in compliance with state law. And then we also have a whole unit that answers consumer questions and investigates complaints made against insurers operating in the state. So it's important to understand that DIFI does not regulate government insurance programs such as the National Flood Insurance Program. That is has been mentioned, throughout this event, that is a FEMA program, and they conduct all the regulation and administration of that. But we do regulate some aspects of private flood insurance products. And so when you have those private companies that are offering these products for sale in Arizona, that's when DIFI would take potentially an active role if there's ever a problem. And I think Aaron wanted to say something about private insurers in Arizona. So.
Thank you. Hi, Jamie. Thank you very much. Yeah, I wanted to just kind of dovetail with some of the information that Joe from Pima County had mentioned. He's right. There has been an increase in the availability of private flood insurance. And I wanted to, first of all, make a pretty clear distinction between the insurance that you buy through the NFIP programs. It's still sold by insurance agents, and it's the policies are still administered by an insurance company. But the coverage limits and the pricing, as Joe detailed, are established by the federal government. And those are the plans that DIFI doesn't regulate. Now, if somebody has a problem with the insurance agent that sold it to them, if they stole their premium or something like that, you can still file a complaint with the state about the mishandling by the insurance agent. But if it's a problem with the NFIP policy itself, or the coverage or a claim issue, that's all going to be FEMA. But with regard to the private flood insurance policies, we're aware of 9 insurance companies. So I know Joe said there are like 250, but in Arizona, we're aware of 9 insurance companies that have filed flood insurance, private flood insurance policies with the State Department of Insurance. and we review those contracts. In general, the policy, the coverages should be on par with the FEMA coverages that I forget what the limits are now, 250,000, I think. And you can get both coverage for your structure, your house, and you can get coverage for your stuff, your contents. So, that's kind of parallel, but the rates are totally different. They are established entirely by the insurance company's rating process, but those rates are filed with the Department of Insurance, and that is public information. I won't suggest, however, that the way insurance companies develop their rates for insurance products is easy to understand. But it is public information, and it is available if anybody wants it, and you can see those filings through our website. So the insurance company has total control on a private flood insurance policy about whether or not they issue a policy to you. They underwrite, whereas with the NFIP, if you apply for a policy based on whether or not you can afford the premium, they're going to sell you a policy. They can't tell you no. But the private insurance company or the private flood companies can say, you're too much of a risk for us. We will decline to issue a policy to you. And the insurance companies have control over whether or not they're going to renew your policy if it's a private flood policy. So a little bit different, and our sense from the filings we're seeing is that the private flood insurance companies are relatively risk averse. They are writing policies in areas where they think there is very little risk of flood. So they're just, no pun intended, dipping their toe so far into the private flood insurance arena at this point. But there really is some private flood insurance out there. There is also excess flood insurance available from some insurance companies. I think there's probably another half dozen companies out there that might be writing excess flood insurance. So you have an NFIP policy, but you want more coverage than the NFIP policy provides. There are companies that will sell you kind of like umbrella flood insurance coverage. So I just wanted to, those are the points that I wanted to make about private flood insurance. Sorry if I went on too long, Jamie.
No problem. Thank you, Erin. So just some, I should say maybe some facts about floods. Floods are among the most widespread natural disaster in the U.S. When you think about natural disasters, you know, hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, a lot of those are geographically located. We all know, you know, in the Midwest with tornadoes, California potentially for earthquakes, and along the coast for hurricanes and such. But flooding, you know, when you think about, I mean, what states are really immune from flooding? Flooding is very widespread and occurs even in places like Arizona that doesn't, you know, isn't known for getting a lot of rain. So flooding is not just river or arroyo overflow. I think in Arizona, that's what we attribute a lot of when we think about flooding because of the hard landscape and such, and that seems to be what we see a lot. But there's other things that has already been mentioned in the presentations today with mud flows and tidal inundation, things like that are also part of our flooding. So one of the kind of the other interesting things is that 25% of the National Flood Insurance Program policy claims are in non-flood zones. So you would normally think that if you're in a flood zone, you might expect that flooding would occur, but a full quarter of those claims come from outside flood zones, which should cause homeowners and, you know, property owners to pause a little bit and really take notice of where their residence is and what is the likelihood that they might incur some sort of damage as a result of flooding. So it's also really good to mention that this is in bold for us that flood is not covered by homeowners or renters insurance. That is an exclusion. So if a pipe breaks inside your wall at your house and there's water damage, then that is covered by your homeowners or renters insurance. But we'll get into a little bit different or a little bit more about definition of flooding in a later slide. But there is a distinction there. So, just to understand that that if you have flood entering your house from outside, it's not going to be covered by your homeowners or renters insurance. And then there's also been discussion previously about wildfires and how that increases flooding. The lack of vegetation causes that water to not disperse in the same way. And then of course the burn scar on the soil doesn't allow it to absorb into the earth like it once did prior to the flooding. So that water has to go somewhere, and hopefully it's not going into people's houses, but occasionally it does. So why should people research flood insurance? One thing that we believe is that every building is in a flood zone to varying degrees. There's you might think that that your house is completely safe, and it might be, but again, 25% of these claims are outside of a flood zone. And when you think about like neighborhoods and just normal developments, think about if you get enough volume of rain in a short enough amount of time that water can't disperse, it creates a whole issue that might result in floods. So even elevated homes, just depending on those flood events that come 100 years or 500 years, that one-time thing might really cause your building to be all of a sudden in a flood zone where it really wasn't before. So the kind of definition for flood, water that enters your home from outside of ground level, at the ground level, is flood, and it's not covered, again, by standard homeowners insurance. There's been a lot of talk about flood insurance policies. They may sometimes cost less than a homeowner's insurance policy, but the distinction is that it is in addition to homeowners coverage. It does not take the place of homeowners insurance. So you might have both, but you can't just have flood insurance and then be protected in the same way, because they protect different occurrences at your home. You can buy flood insurance that covers your house and structure, and another one to cover your belongings. So this is maybe a little bit different than what we're used to with standard homeowner policies. Homeowner policies, you set limits on the protection for your structure, how much it's going to protect. You do the same with policy limits for the contents. You can set those and individualize that within the homeowner's policy. But on flood insurance policies, those are separate policies. And so you buy one to protect your structure, and you buy a second to protect your belongings. Again, those are all individual decisions made by homeowners, but just to understand that it is different than homeowners policy, and you need to make sure that you understand what you're trying to protect. So renters, can buy flood insurance for their belongings as well. Renters often buy renter's insurance. They're not worried about protecting the structure because they don't own it, but they are worried about protecting their contents. And when it comes to flood insurance, again, this would be in addition to renter's insurance, because your standard renter's policy is not going to cover damage caused by flood. So a renter might find it useful to have two policies as well. And then generally, you have to purchase flood insurance in advance, 30-day waiting period, which makes sense because if people waited till they saw the atmospheric river coming toward them or some sort of storm to run and buy flood insurance, there's a good chance that an insurance company would not sell it to them, knowing because they can watch the weather maps as well. And ultimately, you need the insurance companies are in business, unless they're a government company, which doesn't necessarily need to make a profit, but you need a lot of good years to make up for the bad years. And so they want to be able to create this 30-day waiting period for people to make decisions on whether they think they might need flood insurance, And then of course, the insurance companies and the government are hoping that there are very few claims that come as a result of that. So this graph, I was able to obtain this from the National Flood Insurance Program. It represents 45 years of history in Arizona. And these are the bar graph, are the number of claims over those years. It starts in 1978. The last one is, I think the last full year is 2022. And this is interesting just because it shows that that there are some years that are really high. Those are the bad years for the insurers. And that's probably the result of, even though I don't have the specific details, probably the result of significant storms rolling through or just generally wet years. And so, as you can see, you know, a lot of times the claims are really low in Arizona. And these are claims made to the National Flood Insurance Program. They are not necessarily claims that are paid by the NFIP. So this is a combination of all claims made. Some of those claims are not paid, and I don't have the detail to understand exactly why those claims wouldn't be paid, but it is a combination. That does not represent totally paid claims. So as you can see, over that 45-year history, 5,234 claims made, and the NFIP paid out almost $60 million. And in Pima County, that number is significantly lower, 567 claims paying out $7.56 million. So how do I buy flood insurance? I know this has been covered today quite a bit, but you can research your property's flood risk at floodsmart.gov. When I went on there, you type in FloodSmart into your search bar, and the first thing that comes up for me anyway was floodsmart.com. That is not the government agency. That is not FEMA. That is not the NFIP. That is a business that is trying to sell you flood insurance. So it's really important that you have the .gov extension and to select that one. You can also call your homeowner's insurance agent. They may or may not sell these policies, but if they don't and you're still interested in researching it, you can go back on that NFIP site, FloodSmart, and look for the agent insurer, and you can find one at that web address there, somebody who does sell NFIP policies in Arizona. And what I wanted to show you real quick was I thought it was all interesting when I was kind of just milling around the site. It doesn't take long. You get their landing page, you go down to maps. I clicked on it. I put my address in because I live fairly close to what is normally a dry riverbed, which is represented on this map by the orange and teal striations there. So what I found here was that I live in a standard neighborhood in Glendale. That striation area shows that it's a natural waterway, but there is a flood zone all there in teal up above that in the upper left-hand corner. So I was just happy to see that I wasn't in a flood zone. I kind of knew it. I wasn't, haven't been paying any type of flood insurance, but it is interesting that flood zone is in an area that there's no houses, and I'm sure that if there will be houses there eventually, and developers will have to come in and make all of the adjustments to take that out of a flood zone, of course. And so these are the, and I think a lot of these have already been given, but these are just contact information that we have for Pima County, Tucson, who we've already heard from, and then a telephone number for the town of Marana. Leave that up for just a second in case somebody wanted to jot something down. We have a second page coming up, which is Santa Cruz, the town of Sarita, and the town of Oro Valley. That is the information we have for contact. And then just for kind of another interesting thing for homeowners to do to kind of, if they're just interested in their property and the risk associated with it. We've already kind of talked about floodsmart.gov, but risk factor, which has already been talked about, riskfactor.com. If you go on there, there's an opportunity to place your address in a box, and what comes up is, this is again my address, which I thought was interesting. They have a very outdated picture of my house from probably a decade or so, or maybe even longer. They have a satellite view of where it's located. But more interestingly, down at the bottom in the color-coded areas, they show what the flood factor is at my house, which is a number 1, which is minimal. There's a fire factor, which is a wildfire factor, which they show as major, being number 5, which I thought was interesting in that, you know, there's no forested lands or anything but around me. And then the heat is severe, which I can attest to that living in Glendale. And then the green teal color is a wind factor, which is also minimal also. But it just goes to show you that there's a lot of resources out there for homeowners to assess what their risk is. And if you're interested in, you know, finding out, you know, should I get in flood insurance? Should I not? These are great places to start. And then that might prompt some additional questions that you would want to take to your specific city or counties as well. So with that, I can take any questions, or I certainly give Aaron an opportunity to have any closing thoughts or supplement anything that I've said. Aaron?
Thanks, Jamie. I would just say I love being a part of these presentations because I always learn something from the local governments, and I am always I always come away from this event, since we're up in Maricopa County, and after having done this with the Pima County region for several years now, I always come away thinking, gee, I hope the Maricopa County municipalities and government organizations are doing what the Southern Arizona communities are doing. Because I think it's you know, these events where, you know, they're making sure that their community members are getting discounts for flood insurance as a result of these and other activities is just wonderful. And then just hearing about all of the flood mitigation activities that the local communities have, those, you know, I wrote them down, the reinforcing those riverbeds and, you know, drainage and levees and diversion and all of that stuff. So it's, you know, as a resident of Arizona, it's really nice to know that our you know, local governments are doing so much to try to protect us from this. And then, yep. And hopefully folks, you know, take away from this that it's a good idea to figure out whether or not, you know, what is your flood risk and what can you do to mitigate that flood risk. And then even if you're not in a flood zone, maybe find out what flood insurance would cost. When I do these presentations, I always talk about the fact that when I moved into my neighborhood, it's just a regular old neighborhood with streets, and the first summer we lived here, there was a monsoon rain, and I walked out my front door and my street was a river. It was curb to curb. I mean, curb to curb. People were on their little floaty rafts going down the street. And I thought, I think I'm going to research flood insurance, even though I'm nowhere near a flood, you know, high risk flood zone. So anyhow, hopefully folks got something out of this, and the state really appreciates the opportunity to participate. Thanks, and great job, Jamie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Aaron, James, John, Joseph, John here, Erica at the City of Tucson PIO team. Thanks everybody for getting this together. I hope that to those listening and watching, the information is useful. As I said before, and I think everybody reiterated, is that's why we're here. This is what our jobs are. So don't hesitate to reach out and contact us. And hopefully you learned something today and found the information useful. So I don't believe we have any questions in the box, so I'll leave it at that. I just want to thank everybody again, the jurisdictions, for being here. It's good to see everybody and continue to work with you. So thank you, everybody.